It was well past midnight when Jordan's shift had begun to drag into that strange, hollow silence that only comes when a fast food restaurant is technically still open but effectively deserted. Outside, the street lamps hummed weakly, casting pale cones of light onto the empty parking lot. Inside, the hum of the fryers was a constant companion, the air heavy with the smell of stale oil. Jordan was alone at the counter. His co-worker, Luis, was mopping the kitchen in the back when the automatic doors slid open without warning. The sound made him jump. At this hour, customers came in maybe once every half hour, and usually only through the drive-thru that a man stepped inside. He didn't seem drunk, but something about him felt off. He was dressed in a thin, oversized coat despite the warmth inside, and his face was partially shadowed by a baseball cap pulled low. His movements were oddly deliberate, as though each step was a conscious choice. Jordan put on his best polite smile. "Hey, welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood just past the door, scanning the dining area slowly, his head turning in stiff increments, eyes glinting under the fluorescent lights. Finally, in a voice that sounded like it had been used for days, the man said, "Just a coffee." Jordan rang it up, fingers feeling oddly clumsy on the touchscreen. The man paid in cash, crumpled, damp bills that smelled faintly of mildew, and took a seat in the farthest booth, near the shadowy corner where the light bulb above had been out for weeks. Jordan poured the coffee, brought it over, and placed it in front of him. The man didn't thank him. He just stared at the steam curling up from the cup, as if it were spelling something in the air. Minutes passed. Luis finished mopping and poked his head out to say he was taking the trash to the dumpster. Jordan nodded, watching him leave through the back door. When he turned back, the booth in the corner was empty, coffee untouched, still steaming. He blinked, scanning the restaurant. There was no sign of the man. The automatic doors hadn't opened again, and the bathroom door was still ajar. A cold ripple crawled up Jordan's spine. He checked under the table, then turned in a slow circle, his own reflection staring back from the glass windows. Outside, the parking lot remained empty. When Luis came back in, Jordan asked him if he'd seen anyone leave. Luis frowned. No one was out there. Just the trash bins and, he hesitated, looking unsettled. "Never mind." But Jordan pressed him, and finally Luis said, "I thought I saw someone standing in the corner by the dumpster, but when I looked again, it was just gone." The fryers hissed in the background, and somewhere near the front, the automatic doors whispered open again, though neither of them had touched them. Amelia sat bolt upright, the sound unmistakable this time. 3 precise knocks, measured and deliberate, echoing from the living room window downstairs. She held her breath, waiting, listening. The old farmhouse groaned in the silence, as though the structure itself were straining to hear. Amelia's rational mind struggled to keep control, whispering that it might be the wind or a loose shutter she'd missed. But deep in her chest, the heavier truth pressed. The sound was too human, too intentional. Someone, or something, was knocking to be let inside. For several minutes, she sat frozen, debating what to do. Call the police? The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and cell service in the house was unreliable at best. If someone really was outside, would they even wait that long? She thought of the long, empty dirt road leading to the house, the way her car sat in the driveway like a beacon. Whoever was out there had chosen this place for a reason. Amelia wrapped her quilt around her shoulders like armor and slipped from the bedroom, careful to avoid the groaning boards that marked the hallway. The staircase loomed before her, its banister polished to a dull shine by generations of hands. As she descended, each step creaked despite her effort, the sound swallowed quickly by the thick stillness below. The living room was dark, the outlines of furniture warped by the moonlight spilling through the curtains. Again, the sound came. Tap, tap, tap. She flinched as she realized it was not at the front door, where she might expect a late-night visitor, but at the wide picture window that faced the fields. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Echoing in her chest, Amelia edged closer, squinting at the glass. At first, she saw only her own reflection staring back. Wide eyes, pale face, the quilt pulled tightly around her frame. Then, just behind that reflection, something shifted. A blur of movement. It was gone before her eyes could fully register it. But she was certain something had been looking in at her. Her skin prickled as though the air itself had grown sharp. She forced herself forward, fingers trembling as she touched the curtain's edge. With one swift pull, she flung it open. The field lay quiet, bathed in silver moonlight, stretching empty for miles. No footprints in the grass, no shadowed figure fleeing into the dark. Just silence, thick and unyielding. But as Amelia stood there, clutching the curtain in disbelief, her gaze drifted lower. On the glass, smeared faintly in condensation, were three pale impressions. Knuckles, as though someone had pressed their hand flat against the window before retreating into the night. Amelia didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat in the armchair across from the window, staring at those faint knuckle marks until the first dull gray of dawn softened the horizon. Every so often, she swore she heard movement outside, grass rustling, gravel crunching faintly on the long driveway. But each time she checked, there was nothing. When the sun finally rose, she convinced herself she had overreacted. Perhaps some late-night trespasser had thought the house abandoned and knocked out of mischief before running off. Yet the handprints on the glass remained, faint but undeniable, and they made that explanation feel hollow. The day passed uneventfully, but the farmhouse no longer felt safe. Every creak seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. Amelia tried to distract herself by unpacking boxes and cleaning, telling herself that order would restore a sense of control. She found old photographs tucked away in drawers, sepia portraits of stern-looking families, their faces stiff and unsmiling. None of them bore names, and their dark eyes seemed to follow her around the room. Unease grew in her chest, though she tried to push it down, whispering practical excuses: age, isolation, and exhaustion. By evening, she almost believed herself, but when night fell again, the farmhouse exhaled a different kind of silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful, charged with a tension Amelia could taste at the back of her throat. She retreated to her bedroom upstairs, forcing herself to write at her desk by lamplight, trying to drown out the sensation of being observed. Hours ticked by without incident, and she began to relax, even laugh at her own paranoia. Then, just as her pen scratched the final line of a sentence, she heard it, the unmistakable creak of a footstep in the hallway outside her room. Her body froze, the pen dropping silently to the floor. The farmhouse was old, yes, but footsteps had a rhythm, a weight. This one carried intention, the slow, deliberate pressure of someone shifting their weight across the warped boards. She strained to listen, her heart pounding so hard she worried it would drown out the sound. Another step, closer this time. Amelia's hand reached for her phone, but the screen showed no service, as if the house itself had swallowed the signal whole. Gathering every shred of courage, she rose and moved toward the door, her bare feet silent against the wood. She pressed her ear against it, listening. The hallway was still, empty. For a moment, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then, just as she reached for the doorknob, something shifted on the other side. A faint scrape, like nails dragging lightly across the wood. Amelia snatched her hand back, her breath caught in her throat. Whoever, or whatever, was in the hallway was standing just inches away. Amelia stood frozen at the door, her breath shallow and uneven. The faint scraping sound had stopped, but she knew something lingered just beyond the wood. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, yet the not knowing was unbearable. She thought of the window downstairs, the handprints pressed into the glass. If she didn't face this now, the fear would consume her. Her trembling fingers curled around the cold brass doorknob. For a long, quivering moment, she stood there in silence, listening to her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, with one sudden burst of courage, she yanked the door wide open. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by the weak glow of moonlight spilling through the small upstairs window. Nothing moved. The wallpaper, faded and peeling in places, looked almost skeletal in the pale light, patterns twisting into strange shapes. Amelia held her breath, waiting for something, anything, to reveal itself. But the hallway remained empty. No intruder, no figure lurking in the shadows. Only the long, suffocating silence of an old house that seemed to mock her courage. She nearly laughed in relief. But the sound caught in her throat when she noticed the floorboards just outside her door. The wood bore fresh marks. For long scratches cut deep into the grain, as though something with claws had dragged itself slowly past her room. Amelia crouched down, her stomach twisting as she touched the grooves. They were real, not imagination, not a trick of light. Her hands shook as she pulled back, and she suddenly realized the faint smell lingering in the hall, like damp earth, raw and heavy, as though the fields themselves had crept into the house. She forced herself to stand and back away, every nerve screaming for her to return to the safety of her room. But before she could retreat, a sound rose from the far end of the hallway. At first, it was so soft she thought it was her own breathing echoing back at her. Then it grew clearer, raspy, broken, like someone whispering her name. Amelia. The word stretched, cracked, as though dragged from a throat that had not spoken in years. Her legs weakened, and the courage that had brought her to the door dissolved instantly. She stumbled backward into her room, slamming the door shut and twisting the lock with shaking hands. Her chest heaved, panic clawing at her lungs as the whisper came again. Closer this time, just outside the door. Amelia. The handle rattled once, twice, but didn't turn. And then, silence. She pressed her back to the door, clutching the quilt against her chest, every muscle trembling as though waiting for the wood to splinter. For hours she stayed like that, too afraid to move, until dawn finally broke and light spilled across the floorboards. Only then did she dare to breathe. The daylight gave Amelia courage, though it was a fragile, brittle thing. She spent the morning checking every lock, every window, searching for signs of forced entry. Aside from the gouged floorboards in the hallway, there was nothing. No footprints on the stairs, no smudges on the doors. The house seemed to mock her again, wearing its silence like a mask. But when she returned to the window in the living room, her stomach twisted. The faint handprints from the night before were gone, wiped clean as though someone had stood in that very spot and erased them while she slept by afternoon. She decided she couldn't spend another night alone in the house. She drove into town, planning to book a motel. The locals at the diner eyed her with the same wary curiosity they had when she first arrived weeks ago, though their glances lingered a bit longer this time. She overheard two of them whispering about the old place on Miller's Road and how she'll learn soon enough. When she asked directly, their faces closed like shutters. Best to keep to town after dark, one of them muttered. No one offered more. No one ever did. That evening, Amelia drove back reluctantly, just to pack a bag. She promised herself she'd leave before dusk. But as the sun dipped low, the fields around the farmhouse came alive in a strange way. The tall grass shifted though no wind stirred it, bending in patches as if something unseen was moving through. The sight rooted her to the porch, keys still in her hand, as dread crept over her skin. Then she saw it, a shape, tall and narrow, standing perfectly still in the distance. It was not a tree. It was not a shadow. It was watching her. Amelia blinked hard, her mind scrambling for rational explanations. A fence post? A trick of the light? But as the sun sank further, the figure seemed to lean, tilting unnaturally in a way no object should. Her throat dried as she realized it hadn't been there before. For several seconds, neither she nor the thing moved. The silence stretched until the air itself seemed to pulse with tension. Then, with a sudden lurch, the figure disappeared. Gone so quickly it was as though it had never been there at all. The grass swayed where it had stood, as though disturbed by its passage. Amelia bolted back into the house, slamming the door and throwing the locks. She told herself to leave immediately, but her legs refused to move. Her suitcase lay open upstairs, half-packed, as if mocking her hesitation. Outside, the fields rustled faintly though the air remained still. She pressed her ear to the wall, every muscle rigid, and heard it, a low, drawn-out sound, not quite a moan and not quite a sigh. It came from everywhere at once, seeping through the walls, settling deep into the bones of the house. Amelia should have left. Every instinct screamed at her to get in the car and never look back, but fear rooted her where she stood. By the time she gathered enough willpower to climb the stairs and finish packing, the last light of day had drained from the sky. The farmhouse groaned in the twilight, the wood settling into its nightly chorus of sighs and cracks. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds was something new, an almost imperceptible rhythm, like the hush of footsteps pacing just outside the walls. She switched on every light in the house, desperate for comfort, but the glow only made the shadows more pronounced. The old photographs she had uncovered earlier seemed to glare at her from the walls, their eyes reflecting the lamplight with a strange, dull gleam. Amelia tried to drown her fear in motion, stuffing clothes into her bag, gathering papers from her desk, but the noise outside grew clearer. The rustling of grass had given way to the crunch of gravel, deliberate and steady. Someone was walking up the long driveway toward the house. Her heart thudded violently as she crept downstairs and pressed herself against the front door, listening. The footsteps stopped at the porch. Silence, thick and suffocating, filled the air. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, precise and controlled. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same rhythm she had heard at the windows before, but this time it was louder, more insistent. Amelia's breath came shallow and ragged. Whoever, or whatever, was outside was no longer content with watching. It wanted in. She backed away from the door, clutching the phone in her hand though the screen still showed no service. The knocking came again, harder now. Tap, tap, tap. The wood quivered beneath the blows, and Amelia's legs threatened to give out. Summoning courage, she edged toward the living room window and pulled the curtain aside just an inch. At first, she saw only darkness beyond the porch light. Then a shape emerged, tall, thin, leaning slightly forward as if it had no strength to stand upright. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Amelia felt its gaze land on her with crushing weight. The figure didn't move, didn't shift or sway. It simply stood there, hand pressed against the glass of the door as though waiting for her to open it. The porch light flickered once, then twice, and went out, plunging the entryway into darkness. The sound of the hand sliding down the wood filled the silence, long and slow, like wet leaves dragging across a window pane. Amelia stumbled back, her body trembling uncontrollably. She knew, without a shred of doubt, that the thing outside was no stranger, no lost traveler. It had come for her, and it wasn't leaving. The silence after the porch light died was unbearable. Amelia stood in the middle of the living room, every lamp burning behind her, as though light alone could hold back what lingered outside. She waited for the knock to return, but instead came a new sound, slow pressure against the door, the groan of wood bending under weight. The doorknob rattled once, a violent twist, and then again, harder. Someone was trying to come inside. Amelia staggered backward, eyes locked on the door, throat tight with terror. The old farmhouse was sturdy, built in another era, but the lock had always felt fragile. With each shudder of the door, Amelia imagined the deadbolt snapping like brittle bone. She wanted to scream, to shout into the night that whoever it was had chosen the wrong house, but her voice refused to rise. Instead, she fled to the kitchen, heart racing, searching for something, anything, that might protect her. Her hands fumbled across drawers, pulling out knives, but they looked absurdly small in her shaking grip, like toys against whatever waited outside. The pounding began. Not the polite rhythm of knocking anymore, but heavy blows that made the wood tremble in its frame. The pictures on the wall rattled, one crashing to the floor and shattering glass across the boards. Amelia pressed herself against the far wall, covering her ears, tears spilling freely now. She wanted to run upstairs, to barricade herself in her room, but something about turning her back on the door felt even more dangerous. She forced herself to look, to see if the lock with the door bulged inward with each strike. Shadows spilled through the narrow cracks around the frame, stretching across the floor like grasping hands. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pounding stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Amelia's breaths came ragged, shallow, her chest burning with the weight of holding herself still. She thought it might finally be over, that perhaps the thing had given up. But then, from the other side of the door, came a sound that made her blood run cold. Slow, deliberate breathing that it was deep, uneven, as though the lungs drawing it in had not breathed for centuries. Each exhale scraped the wood, vibrating through the air, so close Amelia felt the heat of it through the cracks. She stared, frozen, as the breathing grew louder, angrier, until it suddenly cut off mid-inhale. Silence again. Amelia's knees weakened, and she sank against the wall. She didn't dare approach the door, not now. She only knew one thing for certain. Whatever was outside had decided it would not be knocking anymore. The night dragged on in suffocating silence. Amelia sat curled in the corner of the living room, knife clutched tight in her trembling hand, eyes fixed on the door. Hours seemed to pass without movement, until fatigue began to blur her fear. Just as her head dipped, the sound came again, a faint, sickening creak. Not from the porch this time, but from the hinges themselves. Her stomach dropped as she watched the front door tremble, then ease open, inch by inch, though the deadbolt had never been turned. The air changed immediately. A heavy dampness poured into the room, carrying the smell of wet soil and something older, sour, like decay buried deep beneath the ground. The lamps flickered, their light shrinking into small, struggling pools as though the darkness was swallowing them whole. Amelia pressed herself deeper into the corner, knife raised uselessly, as the tall figure stepped across the threshold. Its form was wrong, too long, too narrow, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as though joints had been misplaced. The figure didn't rush her. It didn't need to. Instead, it paused in the center of the living room, tilting its head as if listening. The dim light caught just enough to suggest the outline of a face, but where features should have been there was only smoothness, shifting faintly, like mist caught behind glass. Its presence filled the room with a crushing weight, as if the house itself was straining under the burden of hosting it. The knife in Amelia's hand felt like a child's toy against something that should not exist. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her. Her legs locked, her throat closed, as though the thing's very nearness had stolen control from her. The figure moved then, slow and deliberate, turning its faceless head toward the staircase. For a terrifying moment, she thought it had lost interest in her, that it would simply drift upstairs. But then it stopped, cocked its head again, and released a sound, a low, guttural whisper. It spoke her name, Amelia. Her paralysis shattered into raw panic. She scrambled toward the kitchen, slipping on broken glass as she ran. The thing didn't follow immediately, but its whisper carried through the rooms, brushing against her ears no matter where she moved. She yanked open the back door, praying it wasn't sealed like the front. The handle turned easily, but as she pulled it open, cold air rushed in, and standing just beyond the threshold was another figure. Identical. Waiting. The sight of the second figure froze Amelia mid-breath. It stood framed in the back doorway, identical in its grotesque proportions, its head cocked in the same unnatural angle as the first. The two shapes seemed to echo one another, as though one thought and the other responded, their movements eerily synchronized. The knife slipped from Amelia's hand, clattering uselessly to the floor. She knew then that there was no outrunning this. No matter which door she fled through, one of them would always be waiting. The kitchen lights sputtered and died, plunging the back half of the house into shadow. Amelia stumbled back into the living room where the first figure remained, unmoving, faceless head still turned toward her. She backed against the staircase, her hands trembling against the banister. Upstairs seemed like the only escape, but the thought of trapping herself on the second floor filled her with sick dread. Still, the figures blocked both doors, and outside the windows the fields writhed faintly, as though filled with countless more waiting just out of sight. The two figures began to move then, not rushing, but gliding forward with unbearable slowness. Each step brought with it that sickening scent of earth and decay, filling her lungs until she gagged. Their bodies bent as they walked, their limbs folding and stretching wrong, as though bones shifted beneath their skin. The floorboards groaned under their weight, though neither figure seemed entirely solid, their outlines wavering faintly in the dim light. Amelia pressed herself harder against the stairs, whispering desperate prayers she hadn't said since childhood. Amelia. The whisper came again, but this time from both figures at once, their voices layered, scraping across her nerves like rusted metal. Her name repeated in uneven rhythm, over and over, until the sound filled the entire house. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices pressed through her skull as though they weren't entering by sound at all, but directly into her mind. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw faces, dozens of them, flickering faintly across the smooth surfaces of the figures' heads. Pale, screaming, suffocated faces. Something inside Amelia broke. She bolted up the stairs, driven by sheer panic, the whispering voices trailing her every step. She slammed her bedroom door and shoved her dresser against it, her muscles burning with terror-fueled strength. The house trembled with the weight of the figures below, their footsteps pacing, circling, waiting. She pressed herself against the far wall, shaking violently, as the voices grew louder still, now whispering not just her name, but something else, something she couldn't quite understand. And then, amid the chorus, she caught three words that made her blood run colder than ever. "You belong here." The dresser against the bedroom door rattled violently as the figures pressed against it. Amelia braced her back against the wall, too exhausted to cry, too terrified to scream. The whispers filled the room in overlapping waves. Her name, the rasping promises of "you belong here," and other words she could not decipher. The air grew thick, damp, heavy with the stench of earth and rot. She could feel the house itself trembling under the weight of their presence, as if its very foundations strained to hold them. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The dresser stood still, the door silent. For a moment, she thought they had gone. Then, from behind her, the window rattled. Amelia spun just in time to see the glass misting over, a pale hand pressing against it from the outside, despite her being on the second floor. Another hand joined it, then another, until the window was smothered in grasping prints. Faces flickered in the glass, their mouths open in silent screams, pressing against the barrier as though desperate to get in or to drag her out. The walls shuddered, the floor groaned, and then came the voice again. Not a whisper this time, but a roar that filled every corner of the farmhouse. "You belong here." The dresser toppled forward, flung aside as though by unseen hands, and the door burst open. The two figures from downstairs entered, their faceless heads tilting in unison, their limbs folding grotesquely as they advanced. Amelia pressed back against the wall, clutching the quilt like a shield, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She wanted to fight, to resist, but the closer they came, the heavier her body grew. Her legs locked, her arms fell limp, as if her will itself were being drained. The smooth faces of the figures shimmered, and for the first time she saw her own reflection flicker there, trapped, suffocated, screaming silently among the others. A cold hand reached for her, pressing against her chest, and she felt it not on her skin but inside her lungs, pulling the breath from her body. The farmhouse groaned one final time, as though sealing itself shut. When dawn rose the next morning, the farmhouse stood quiet and still. The lamps were burnt out, the rooms undisturbed, the doors locked from the inside. Of Amelia, there was no sign. Only the faintest impression of handprints on the bedroom window, as if someone had pressed their palms desperately against the glass before fading away. The house waited in silence, patient and watchful, for the next traveler to arrive. For those who pass by on Miller's Road say the same thing when the fields bend without wind. The old house is never empty.